This is Mind Your Business, and I'm your host, Bob Burnett. I'm the founder of Barefoot Mining, a former CTO for the PC company Gateway, and a Bitcoin evangelist. Today, I welcome Ryan Condron. Ryan is the CEO of Titan, an up-and-coming provider of software services to the Bitcoin mining industry, and a critically important entry into the mining pool world. Let's drop in now on my conversation with Ryan.
So Ryan, great to see you. It's been a long time. We got a chance to sit on a panel together in Miami, which is where I got to meet you, and I enjoyed being on that panel to you, and quickly realized that we had a lot of similar philosophical approaches to the world and to Bitcoin, and so it's really a pleasure to have you on today.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I always like to start in these sort of interviews with a little bit about the person, but I like to really start kind of early. So tell me, what was your childhood like? Were you an athlete? Were you a musician? Were you the nerd? Were you the party guy? Tell me a little bit about the younger Ryan.
You started early. I was thinking like early, like 10 years ago, early. Early. I was the kid that would play for hours and hours in his room with Legos. So literally my room, like the entire floor of my room was just covered with Legos for 5 hours a day, 6 hours a day. And I would just, that was my heaven. So I would just build everything and anything, from for as long as I can remember. But now, I have kids, so that's my excuse. I still play with Legos, but now I have a proper excuse.
That's awesome. And so as you got a little older, were you then kind of still that same guy? Were you the tinkerer? Were you the guy that worked on cars? Were you the guy that built solar panels? What were you doing?
I was the kid that I took to computers really, really quickly. So I remember when I was like 10, my dad had an old laptop that was busted, and it was running an old version of DOS, and so I started playing around with that, and I found out I could get some games on it, and loaded games. And I found QBasic and started playing around with QBasic, and learning a lot of the basics of programming against DOS.
Was this by the chance like early 90s? What period was this?
Yeah, this was early 90s.
Okay.
So playing, I think it was a Gateway laptop.
Wow.
Funny enough. So
what?
It was the screen was like this big.
Wow.
And
wow, that's amazing. So that was something I designed then. What you were working on.
Funny enough, yeah.
Wow.
And so that was my intro into coding. Was we would go on a family trip, a car trip for several hours, and I'd be in the back on the laptop going through a Visual Basic book when I was 9 or 10. When I was 12, I got upgraded because my dad had his old computer and he passed it off to me, and it had a website builder on it called Front Page, which was one of Microsoft's original front site or website builders.
Yep.
And he told me that if I built a website for our church, he'd give me $100. So that was my mission. I learned HTML and all the different aspects of building a website, and was working with Front Page and all the different frames and forms. And apparently I was taking too long, and he went ahead and built one in parallel. But I ended up spinning off, and starting at 12, I just started building websites for everything. Everything from I had a website for my dog. I had a website for like random businesses I'd come up with. I used to play Age of Empires a lot when that came out, so I started like building websites for Age of Empires, and that was a lot of my early teens, was either tinkering with web stuff, or I played sports too, but a lot of my time went towards software stuff.
Was that, so at that point, was that your passion? You felt, did you already kind of know where you were going at that point?
Not really. I thought I wanted to get into like film. I really loved the idea of like directing, acting, and storytelling. and I thought that was going to be my passion. What I didn't realize then is what you devote your time to is typically what you become good at, and what you become good at is typically what you enjoy doing. So I was devoting so much of my time to building websites, and whenever I had a side project or whatever, it was always web-based. Up through college, after college, through most of my early jobs, I always had side projects that were all web-based. So I've been building web applications and websites for the overwhelming majority of my life, and so I just got really good at it and just stuck with it.
Oh, that's fascinating. This shifted by a generation or two. I had somewhat the same experience. In fact, I was telling you kind of before we got started that I live in South Florida and was impacted by Hurricane Ian, and one of the casualties of the flood, because my house was flooded, was I have a collection of old computers, and I had because and one of the casualties was an old Amiga that I had, and I was almost emotional about it, actually, because when I'm so old, I was my participation in computers predated the personal computer, and as it's defined today, meaning a DOS or Windows based or Mac based. So I was programming on Commodore VIC-20, for instance, was my very first computer, which had 4K of RAM. I had a cassette tape for storage. I had a little black and white monitor that could maybe fit 80 characters on the whole screen because the way it came up. Debugging was an absolute nightmare. And I started to develop my passion kind of in that same time frame, and eventually became TRS-80s, Radio Shack TRS-80s. My high school, we had a little computer program, and I started off on that angle. And I think by the time I started college, I kind of knew what I wanted to do. And interestingly, I started as a software guy, but a software guy then and a software guy now are very different, because a software guy then we were low level. Like when I was in college, I was writing assembly level code. We did some C coding, but we were writing things like operating systems and compilers and debuggers. Like that's that's where things were in the early 80s.
It required low level critical thinking, and when you start out at that level, you have a complete understanding of the systems down here and every subsequent system afterwards. And what I run into with a lot of developers these days is they've learned up here, and then when you ask them, why are they doing it like this, and it's just because that's the way it's done, and then you point out that down here it doesn't make any sense, and it's not optimized,
right?
And it's hard to find developers that can track all the way back down like that.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was thinking. Even kind of where I was going was, if you were working with front page and you were doing HTML development in that era, developing a website in, I'm guessing, 1994 is very different than developing a website today or even 5 years ago. I mean, you don't have to be a coder to make a reasonable website anymore, but
I remember my first web application. So I was out of college. I got hired by a nonprofit to program a time and attendance system, because they had about 600 employees. They were in 14 different offices in 3 different states, and they were still on paper-based time cards. So they said, hey, Ryan, can you build us a time and attendance, web application? And I said, sure. Well, I hadn't built an at-scale web application at this point, but I had so much experience just building websites and HTML coding, and so much just raw code. And I had never used like Visual Studio or a coding engine. I had written everything in Notepad. So when I started writing this web application, I wrote everything in Notepad, everything from pulling in the assemblies at the top of my Notepad file and I modularized everything, and I had just folders and folders full of just straight Notepad files.
Yeah.
And it was the most optimized application I've written to date, because there was no overhead. And I remember when I had left that position, another programmer tried to take that up, and they were asking, what, development environment did I use, and how do they go in and edit the code? And I was like, well, you just open the notepad file and find where you want to go.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but it was pretty crazy. So
Yeah. Well, that's great to hear it. And, I think that what we're going to talk about, at least some of what I want to talk about today, is dive deeper than I think most people typically dive, because I think there are things at the base layer that I think we can discuss, that you can educate people about, that very few people really know. And I think that having at least a decent number of people in the industry that have this base level understanding is really important. I like to think of the world in layers and stacks. And I think you can do it in different ways. You can look at, for instance, one perspective might be, hey, the personal computer is almost like a base layer, and then the internet kind of came on top of that. And what we're doing with Bitcoin is sitting on top of that.
Yeah.
And I think very few people probably think that way about, layers, but Bitcoin is constructed as layers, and a lot of the altcoin infrastructures are trying to do everything kind of without layers, or maybe with minimal layers, and do a whole bunch of things. And, architecturally, I don't really agree with that philosophically. I think it's very hard to do that.
Yeah. So altcoins are interesting. I got into mining in late 2012, and originally we're just mining straight Bitcoin, and that made sense. And we started realizing, with the ASICs coming out and Butterfly Labs starting to ship, what they could produce at the time. And we started realizing that our GPUs were quickly becoming outperformed. So we needed to find something else to do with it. And that's when my buddy came to me. He's like, Ryan, I found this thing called Litecoin. He's like, I mined 5,000 of them yesterday with my GPU. Yeah. He's like, so we need to switch. And because we were looking at BTCE and Vercorex and some of the exchanges back then, and we could actually ROI on our equipment in under 30 days easily. So depending on which altcoin we mined and then converted it to Bitcoin or cash, we could, sometimes ROI in about a week. So that was just depending on the liquidity of the network and the exchanges. So altcoins in the exchanges were actually very lucrative for miners if they could pivot quickly enough. A lot of the altcoins that we were seeing were just carbon copies of Bitcoin, then carbon copies of Litecoin, and carbon copies of like Purecoin if they wanted a proof of stake element. And that was okay for some networks. Like there was one called like Barbecue Coin, which is oftentimes I refer to it as
that one.
It was such this fringe coin. It was out for they launched it for like a week. The developers abandoned it after like a week because it was a dumb meme coin. But it hit like an exchange on Critz, and then it stayed alive for the next like 3 years, where it actually had value, even though the developers had completely abandoned the network. And there was no new technology in it. It was just a free floating coin. And there's thousands and thousands and thousands of coins like that. So altcoins, when they're used to test out new technologies, whether it be like snarks or like the zero knowledge proofs and all, even like Litecoin experimenting with a Lightning network before it hits Bitcoin. There's a lot of great use cases for altcoins. But until a coin is stopped being referred to as an altcoin and it's just a coin, it's just I don't know. There's a lot of them. I don't know what to say about it.
There sure are. Well, that's as we all take a different path to where we end up. And I started because I ended up taking my original knowledge as a software guy probably looks to the I became a hardware guy. And so my career path, as I think the listeners know, is through Gateway and hardware development. That led me into designing Ethereum mining equipment, first of all. And so that's how I got into this, was trying to bring professional grade designs to Ethereum mining equipment. I thought about it as a computer guy first and foremost, though. And it took a while to kind of flip that and start looking at it with the emphasis on Bitcoin. So it was a computer guy looking at it from a fiat mentality, and now I look at it differently. You know, I look at it as a Bitcoin guy, and you know what I do is hopefully provide some of the infrastructure at this base layer to help secure and grow the network. But I think, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I think you're kind of talking about something similar. You know, we all take this journey to get to a certain point, and you know, I would probably be pretty close to a Bitcoin maximalist right now if I'm not. That doesn't mean that I don't think at some point in time somebody will create some coin that has some value. I just haven't seen it myself yet. So and I don't think any of them are going to be money. So
it's hard because I think the litmus test for Bitcoin and these cryptocurrency networks as a currency was always like, can I buy a cup of coffee with it? And I remember getting a lot of discussions in like 2013 of like, well, how do I buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoin? And it's gotten to the point now where it's like, well, why would you want to? Because we're seeing Bitcoin as a really a place to hold value, a place to hold funds, rather than necessarily a daily transactional network. And I really think as time goes on, these different networks are going to find their use case. So Ethereum really became like the grand central station of tokens and Web3 and all these DeFi products. I mean, for better or worse, it's people really experimenting in the ecosystem and what you can do with this trustless technology. Bitcoin, I think, has the advantage of being very, very hard to change. So I think it's developed a lot slower than the other networks, which is exactly what it's designed to do. I mean, Satoshi purposefully put 10-minute block times, 1 megabyte blocks. It's slow, it's consistent, it's simple. The blockchain pattern for Bitcoin and the reward mechanism is actually very simple and elegant compared to a lot of these other networks. So having it as, you know, the base layer security root or economic root of all these other chains makes a lot of sense, just because it's relatively stable. Whether you look at the markets or not, it's relatively stable technology wise compared to everything else.
Yeah, certainly within its own ecosystem, maybe as measured by external systems, it's volatile. But you know, that's not necessarily a reflection of Bitcoin. It's maybe more a reflection of the external system. So,
one thing I was going to add is, so the parent company for Titan is a company called Block, and that was founded by Jeff Garzik and Matt Rozak. Jeff Garzik was, I think, like the number 3 developer on Bitcoin. So there was like Satoshi, Gavin, and then Jeff. And I had this discussion with Jeff early on when I first came on board with the company. I'm just asking him, like, what was his interactions with Satoshi like, and what did he see that was different when he saw the code base and everything. And he said that when he first saw the Bitcoin code base directly from Satoshi, he said it was essentially unstructured, and it was as though he had written it in Word, like notepad files. So it wasn't in a typical development environment. It was like he had this idea and he made it highly optimized, and he knew the code, and he didn't use like traditional development environments. He wrote the raw code, and that was really encouraging to hear, that it was really anyone that has this low level understanding of programming and has a really good idea. It doesn't matter if you're traditionally trained. It doesn't matter if you've been working engineering jobs the majority of your life. It's like you can write something really cool, really elegant that can change the world. And sorry, that was a complete aside, but that,
you know what though, I love that you brought that up. I'm glad you did, Ryan, and it relates back to what you and I were talking about before. You know, how I started, writing at the operating system level and firmware level. and you writing at the front page level, or the HTML level and websites. And it means that Satoshi did the same thing, because if you, and by the way, I am now a dinosaur as a coder, so forgive me if I'm even off a little bit, but
That's right.
if your code is structured by just taking pieces from different libraries or code that other people have essentially written, and you're piecing it together, I'm not saying there's not value in it, but you're really kind of more of a maybe a high level system architect, kind of putting something together, versus like a craftsman building something, taking a block of wood and turning it into a piece of art.
Great analogy. I think case in point for this, and I always find this rather humorous when it comes up in discussions, like when the U.S. government rolled out like healthcare.gov, and that whole like Obamacare system. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was like hundreds of millions of dollars that they were paying for this insurance portal, that I believe it ended up going to a Canadian contractor that then outsourced it to kind of overseas developers. And the site itself, when you actually loaded the site, it was just so cumbersome. It was slow. It had so many things going on, and it was really bogged down with so many people hitting the site all at once. And I remember looking at the code behind for the site, and it was loading something like 50 or 60 different libraries. And it was literally like you were saying, like they were just pulling in all these different modules from all these different places, and it just created this monstrosity of a site. And I just remember looking at the thing like, well, I could have built something a lot better for a fraction of the price they probably got paid for that. But it just reminded me that that's what a lot of coders do these days. That's a lot of projects end up just being Frankenstein's monster of pulling in elements from other code bases.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me, because I wonder, like, my education served me very well, and I have a degree in it's a computer engineering, which would basically be a blend of computer science and electrical engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I had to learn things like gate design. I did things like design the internal workings of a cache controller or an ALU inside a CPU. We did those types of things. So I have an understanding of the way some of those algorithms work, and the way the CPU is constructed, the way it works, so the CPU interfaces with the memory units and those sort of things. I don't know if they teach that anymore. I'm really not sure. And I had to know that, because my next step was, okay, now I have to build the firmware and then the operating system that sits on top of that. I had to know that. So they may be up here now and lost all this stuff down here.
It's funny that you bring that up, because it's a lot of the hardware we work with these days is just building blocks on top of building blocks on top of building blocks of designs that get borrowed from other designs from other designs. So my background, I study electrical engineering with the emphasis on microelectronic communication. So one of my professors, I think it was my junior year, we had a project where we had to design a better amplifier. And it was, you have typically when you're building circuits, you could just drop in an amplifier that is already a spec piece of, hardware essentially for your circuit. And he said, no, like you're not allowed to use an existing amplifier. You need to design a new one. Yeah. And that was like, it just like blew our minds, because at that moment, like we had to like stop using building blocks that other people gave us. And we really had to start at the low level. You have capacitors, inductors, and resistors. Good luck.
Yes.
And those are the ways we are going to work with the electricity. So from there, then we're working with capacitors and inductors, and we're building different like tank circuits, and we're using like the different building blocks of logic that we understand, and doing that type of design at that level, and then working all the way back up to an actual hardware product. I feel like is becoming a lost art.
Yeah, I think so. And it's a shame. I hope something reverses that course. I have a feeling that a lot of the people doing that level work are now in China.
Yes.
I mean, somebody still has to do that work, right? And I think a lot of that stuff, and I'm sure, you know, Intel has some great like low level chip designers, and as does Nvidia, and they're scattered all over the world. But I don't think in our typical curriculum we're teaching that, and there's the direct effect of that. And then there's also the thought process that goes with it, you know, building the logic in your own head about how to construct something that you can apply to almost anything.
Yeah.
So
it's a whole different level of engineering. I remember reading articles by it was this gal she had like a doctorate in engineering, and she started reading through a lot of old patent applications from like the early 1900s, and the title of these articles were like forgotten technology, essentially technology at the turn of the century where people were tinkering with all these different, you know, newly discovered electrical elements, that, you know, Tesla was coming out with all his patents and all the things he was discovering. Edison Labs was coming out with a lot of things they were discovering, but there were so many patents in the electrical world at the time. But there were so many different technologies around electromagnetics, around EMAG fields and all that. And so she started actually doing deep dives into forgotten technology, that stuff that didn't get included in the original building blocks of our electrical circuits. And then we just don't even realize they exist anymore. And it was absolutely fascinating that there's so many inventions and so many technologies that could be in building blocks that just got left out back in the 50s and 60s. And we don't even utilize this stuff anymore.
yeah, you know, it's funny you say that, because for those of you who haven't ever been involved in the patent process, there's several issues. The patent database is basically just that. It's just a massive database of millions of patents. And you can use this search engine to kind of plow through there, but you got to come up with the right terms to even find what you're looking for. And then once you get there, what you'll realize is that the patent language is not really English. It's even for a person like myself that has been exposed to it. If you can plop down my actual patent application, and I would have a difficult time reading it. And I have several patents, and the reason is that I take my idea. We establish that it's an idea, and it goes to a patent agent or a patent attorney, who then turns it into the text that becomes the patent. And it's not very similar to what I wrote. And so
I think I wrote a paragraph for patent that was like this, and when I got it back from the lawyer, it was like this, and I was like, that okay, I'm gonna trust you on that one, like that it says the same thing.
Exactly. You got to really pay attention to the diagrams, because that visual is actually pretty good. You know, I give an example. I'll share this story with you. While I was working for Gateway, I developed a patent that is used widely across the world, everywhere today, and that's that if you are playing music and or any sort of audio or video stream, and you unplug the headphones or you take out your earbuds and the stream stops, that's my patent, that to detect that occurred, and then
the voltage drop,
and then restart it, of course, if you plug it back in.
Yeah.
And there's a whole reason why I developed that patent, which I know it sounds probably obvious and trivial now, but in what would have been 2002 when I developed that patent. But if you read that patent, you know, good luck figuring out that's what's actually occurring. So I think just
anyone that listens to audiobooks or podcasts then owes you their gratitude, because losing your place when your headphones disconnect is terrible.
Yeah. Well, there's that's why, by the way, it was created. So I guess I'm on a hard time frame today. So in 2001, I was a chief technology officer at Gateway. And we were trying rapidly to expand beyond the PC. So we started developing things like digital cameras, and this is pre-iPod. We said, hey, let's do our own MP3 player. So we were in beta testing. We finally got it working. We're beta testing it, and I do some running. Just a job, I'm not a serious competitive running, but I run several times a week. And at that time, of course, we only had the old corded earbuds.
Yeah.
And we didn't even have things like a nice little sleeve to hold your thing. And those weren't created yet, because there's really like no other of these products in the market. So anyway, I'm running along. I got this cord that's too long, and every once in a while, my elbow would catch the cord and rip the earbuds out of my ear and the thing out. And at that time, all I could listen to, the main thing I was listening to when I ran, still do today, is audiobooks and podcasts. And so what happened to me a couple of times was I'm listening to the audiobook, I rip the cord out, the thing goes flying. By the time I get the thing reassembled and put in my ear, the audiobook was like 2 minutes ahead. And we didn't have, back then, we didn't even have a fancy rewind or anything. Like we hadn't invented that yet. So I was like so frustrated, like, shit, I just missed this part of the book. And then I guess the engineer in me said, well, of course I can detect that from the impedance that the cord's disconnected. So why don't I just stop? And that was it. So,
nice.
There you go.
I mean, well, thank you for inventing that, because it's very helpful.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and so I haven't quite invented anything that useful yet. I think a lot of the stuff that we're working on at Titan, and the things that we're inventing are a little bit further down the road, but hopefully people appreciate them as much as that.
Well, thank you. I'm glad, maybe whatever legacy I leave to the world, at least I got that. So, well, hey, since we talked a little about Titan there, it's probably a good time. Let's introduce Titan to people a little bit. So tell us a little of the history of Titan and why you started it and what you guys are up to right now. And then we'll kind of dive down deeper into mining and pools and some Bitcoin stuff.
So I'll start back kind of at the beginning, where I got into mining in 2012, and it was really, I was working as a software engineer at a local university, and one of my colleagues, Kyle, is just a brilliant software engineer, and he heard about this thing called Bitcoin, and he was researching Butterfly Labs and researching all this different things about mining. And we would go for walks on our break every day, just to regain some sanity from looking at code all day. And he said, "Hey Ryan, so I came across this thing called Bitcoin. It's this digital cash. I've been hearing a lot about it lately." He's like, "But you can mine it." And we're working in IT. We have access to all the computer labs. We have access to all the different types of hardware. So he's like, we should see what we can do with these cryptocurrencies. So we started building mining rigs from there. From there, we started realizing that there's a lot of altcoins, other ways to ROI on your equipment. So we started building hardware profitability comparisons between the different networks. There's different iterations of the story based of how we got from where we were then to now. The shortest iteration is I took a lot of this information and realized that a lot of these altcoins didn't have proper mining pools for them. So I launched a site called Pool Wars back in 2013. We ran about 100 different mining pools for a bunch of different altcoins. And I built a lot of different automated systems around customizable profit switching, switching on difficulty targets, switching on just coin targets, just a lot of different elements of how you wanted to control your devices automatically. And that was all built into this like really easy one-click interface for mining. So since then, there have been several iterations on Pool Wars through 2013, 14, and 15. The market was way low at the time. I ended up taking other software development contracts and kind of forgetting about Bitcoin for a while. I had written a white paper in 2014 that was a seamless, how to explain it? It was a way of scaling any network passively for transaction throughput. and I had called it quick bit. It was this idea of doing private key sharding and clustered consensus around private keys to send transactions on parent networks. It was essentially like a side chain item. So I'd written this paper in 2014. I was working on mining pools through 2015. Took a hiatus until the market started coming back in 2017. And I dusted off the paper and went and presented it to Matt Rozak at the time and said, hey, what do you think about this? Because all my hypotheses about the Bitcoin network having transaction throughput issues and everything we had talked about in 2012 and 2013 was starting to come out in 2017. Yeah. And people were realizing transaction fees are going through the roof. The mempool backlog was crazy. And I was like, okay, well, maybe it's time to implement this. Talked to Matt about it. He saw my background in mining and mining pools. And that's when I joined Block and we launched Titan. And the vision of Titan from the beginning was to make mining as easy as possible at any scale. So we started out actually doing mining management software, and our very first client out of the gate for mining management software had about 25,000 devices. So we jumped in literally wow. head first. And we quickly realized there were a lot of issues with doing granular control of 25,000 devices on a network, where we were doing real-time chip clocking based on heat targets. So we knew that we could up the frequency of the chips at 25 megahertz at a time until we hit a stable heat target. And if we went beyond that, then we'd start downclocking it a little bit, and we would basically balance around the heat of the chip to make sure you don't burn out your devices, but you get the most hash rate out of them. And we were doing that real time for 25,000 devices. That puts a tremendous load on a local network. And so we learned a lot of very important lessons through the course of building the software. Now, a lot of those lessons we started seeing about 2.5 years ago. We started seeing a huge need in the U.S. market for compliant, transparent, and auditable mining pools. We saw a lot of miners going public. We saw a lot of miners here in the U.S. growing. We heard talks in China that the Chinese government didn't like the strain on their grid with the miners, and we just saw the writing on the wall that the U.S. was going to become more and more of a hotspot for mining. Even with just the way the Texas grids work, we just saw that eventually more and more miners were going to start converging in the U.S. So the U.S. mining pool was going to be a big deal. And that's when we took a step back from the management software about 2 years ago. Our CTO at the time, Jethro Grassi, is an amazing pool engineer. He wrote actually the leading implementation of the Monero mining pool from scratch. So we set to work on writing a brand new Bitcoin mining pool from the ground up. So we didn't fork any existing code bases. We didn't borrow any building blocks from other people. Excellent. We literally wrote brand new software that was highly optimized. So it's all written in C. It's incredibly fast, incredibly stable. And the way we built our architecture was scalable and designed to be an in-facility mining pool. So you could actually, for a publicly traded company where they start having multiple sites all over the country, depending on where their electricity contracts are, they're going to want to eventually run their own mining pool for compliance reasons. So we see this flight path. So we actually built our pool architecture to be a series of downstream pools with a single upstream pool. So you can actually put a mining pool server in each one of your facilities. You completely cut out latency. You have 100% uptime of your pool as long as you manage your own network correctly. And then you can turn off things like share validation. So it takes a lot of the overhead of a mining pool off the table. Now you have some of the fastest optimized software running directly in your facility.
So I think there's a lot there, Ryan, and maybe we should stop and just I think generally a very technical audience, but I think some of them are going to want to understand some of this a little more, including me. So let's talk about like you talked about maybe having if I got it right, separate pools at separate sites, and you talked about for compliance reasons. I think I understand there. I want to talk about compliance in a little bit.
Yeah.
And then you talked about the downstream pool too. So can you talk about kind of the interaction between those and that architecture?
Yeah. So one of the biggest lessons we learned when we were writing management software was just the enormous amount of network load. So you have internal chatter between the management software and the miners itself, and then you have a ton of outgoing connections. So when you have 25,000 devices, each one. So for example, like AMP miners, they'll have pool 1, pool 2, and pool 3 in their interface. Well, it doesn't just connect with pool 1 and then the other 2 stay static. It actually sends out 3 connections, and it makes sure that pool 1, pool 2, and pool 3 can all connect, and then it just works on pool 1. But the other 2 do have outgoing connections. So if you have 25,000 devices, you actually have 75,000 outgoing connections. So what a lot of miners will do, they'll ask for a proxy or a mining proxy that will a lot of times either do the work packets locally on behalf of the pool to keep the load off of the pool for having 75,000 incoming connections, and load off of the network of the miner having 75,000 outgoing connections. Or they'll do what's called like a data trunk, where they'll take all incoming connections in the local network. It will like round robin sample, and then it'll have one big outgoing trunk to the pool, and then the pool will untangle the trunk and then divvy out the work to the packets or to the miners connections correctly. So that was a huge lesson that we learned, was just this idea of outgoing incoming connections. And that's when we realized like the best model you could possibly have is to have a mining pool server directly in your facility. Then you don't have to worry about a proxy server. You don't have to worry about an outgoing connection trunk or any of this other overhead. You can actually just mine directly against your own mining pool internally. Now, what a downstream pool and an upstream pool have is the upstream pool is going to be the signing pool that actually has the wallet node, right? So when you find a block in your downstream pool, it's going to push it to your upstream pool for signing, and then that hits your distribution network. But that's going to happen on average once every 10 minutes. If you're really lucky, once every hour. If you're a huge miner, most likely like once or twice a day for a large miner.
Yeah.
So that was the model that we had designed, was having downstream pools in each of the facilities, and then having your upstream pool be the signer.
So at what point, if you've got a mining facility or mining operation of a certain size, where does that, forgive me if the terminology, but the local mining pool server, where do you say, hey, I've got 1,000 machines, I've got 100 machines, I got 50 machines. Where is it that you start saying, well, that this is
so right? It's up to kind of your tolerance for risk. So if you're okay with hitting a block a month, then you could be somewhere in the 100 to 200 petahash range. And for 100 to 200 petahash, you're going to probably be hitting a block a week, honestly, on average for 100% luck. Now, if you want to wait a week to find out that something is wrong or your connection is off or whatever, that's big risk for a lot of large scale miners. That's millions of dollars at risk. So most miners want to see one block every 1 to 2 days. They don't want to go beyond 48 hours without a block. Otherwise, they're wasting time, they're wasting money. So at that rate, you want to have over an exahash typically. That will comfortably get you at least a block every 2 days. And then once you're hitting that every 1 to 2 day target for your block, that's when you really have to start looking at, what's your compliance risk with using a third party pool. If you're a publicly traded company, you need to make sure, and here in the US primarily, you need to KYC AML, your clients, or who's buying your hash rate, or who are you selling your hash rate to. And that's really getting into this idea of who is your pool partner. You're technically selling your hash rate every 24 hours to an FTPS pool. They're buying their hash rate. They're buying your hash rate. They're generating Bitcoin or finding blocks with it, and then paying you out every 24 hours for your hash rate. And it's. I don't know. I have a whole sales cycle, and
I want to get there, but before we do,
yeah.
So again, just for everybody's kind of knowledge, I'm gonna try my best to maybe restate what you've said in a slightly different way, but you tell me if you agree with it's factually correct. So what Ryan's saying is that if you have a operation of a certain size, and let's say you own 1 exahash right now, which would be about roughly 1/2 of 1% of the world's computing power. I'm saying 200 exa. It would be. I'm rounding, right? I know it's a little more than that right now, but then you can expect if you have all that hash dedicated to your own pool, then you would expect 1/2 of 1% of the time to win a block, and which would be 1/200th. And given that there are typically 144 blocks in a day, actually it's actually the average I've calculated is actually closer to like 148 or something like that, because we typically run a little hotter. But basically, so what Ryan's saying is you would win about roughly between every 1 to 2 days then, right? Because you win 1/200th. And he used the term your luck factor. He's basically saying your luck factor is how close you come to that norm, right? So you normally win 1 to 2 days, but as anybody knows, this is or not everybody knows, but it's a random event, much like flipping a coin. And so you could theoretically flip a coin and get 10 heads in a row. And if that associated with a loss, then you could have a really bad run of bad luck and be collecting no revenue in that time period. And it doesn't mean that, by the way, when you finally win it, that you win enough to make up for the whole thing. You're now, it's now like the next coin toss, meaning, you will over, if you can stay with it over an extended period of time, they will return to the mean, but that could be a very long time.
That is the general assumption we have, is that over time statistics will be true and balance out, right? So for Bitcoin mining profitability, the assumption and tribal knowledge is that if you mine long enough with consistency, that you will hit 100% profitability. And sometimes you'll be more profitable, sometimes you'll be less profitable with like luck factor. There's probably a lot of other elements in like the quantum mechanic principles of like positive thinking and all this other stuff that might affect things. But mathematically, yes, like over time statistics for mining should be 100% profitability. But
it's like I said, like anything, the path to getting there could be very rocky. It could be, and the opposite is true. You could have massive prosperity for a given period of time too.
Our mining pool, for example, like we were running something small, like 15 petahashes when we were in test mode, and this was earlier this year, I think, back in February. We were doing some internal testing. We had 15 petahashes against the pool, and we hit 2 blocks in one day, running 15 petahashes. And we're just like, the odds were just incredible. And like right then, I was like, okay, we should just shut it off.
Shut it down. They'll never be better.
We're done. We're like, that's as lucky as we're gonna get. But and then running 200 petahashes, we might not hit a block for 2 weeks. When we should have hit a block 1 per week. So over time, the idea is over the next year we should hit 100% luck, but it doesn't always play out like that. So.
Hence the life of a miner. Now you started to talk about, and I'd love to see if, because you do this probably more frequently than me, maybe walk people through FPPS, PPS, PPLNS, PPLNS plus, You know,
Oh,
all of those sorts of things. Let's do your best to give us 90 seconds on that.
so the funny thing about this is these are like unofficial terms that have kind of developed over the past decade. And not everyone adheres to the same definitions. And we've kind of landed on general definitions, but like it's kind of like this democratic process where some pools over in Asia might have a slight definition or difference between what a U.S. pool might have.
I want to interject. I'm sorry. So
Yeah.
what I'm asking Ryan about is there are different methods by which
Yep.
pool contributors, people who attach themselves to a pool, generate income from the pool itself, and there's different payout philosophies.
Yeah, let me walk through the different payout philosophies that I've seen, and I know there's twists on some of them, but so traditionally the first one was like PPLNS, was essentially in common terms is you don't get paid until I get paid type thing. So it's when the pool finds a block, then based on how much difficulty you have sent that pool over the last 24 hours or however long that stage was between the last block and the current block, all that effort then is divided up in ratio to the miners. The problem with that is you don't get consistent payouts unless it's a really big pool. So that's PPLNS, is pay per last number of shares. So this idea that you have a block round. So the last block was the start of the round, the next block is the end of the round, and then all the effort submitted by all the miners between here and here gets divided up in ratio. There's something called like a PPLNS plus or PPS plus. So PPS is pay per share. It's the idea of you're going to get paid out per share regardless if they find a block or not. This was developed to help give more consistent payouts to miners every 24 hours. That's typically done based off of a profitability calculation of the previous difficulty of the previous block. So it's a guesstimate. It's a pretty good guesstimate, and like we said, over time it should statistically be 100% profitability. But that had to be differentiated then from FPPS, which is full pay per share, because that's when pools started doing a little bit of gaming stuff where they started saying, well, we'll pay you out for the block reward, but we're not sharing the transaction fees with you. So a lot of pools early on were actually keeping the transaction fees for themselves, and then they were just paying out on the block reward. So then other pools came out and said, well, we're full pay per share, we're paying out all the transaction fees plus the block reward, and we're putting all that together. There's other payout methods of, if you're the miner that actually finds the block, you get a bonus. If you're mining with the pool for longer, then sometimes you get like a weighted bonus. There's so many different payout methods and different ways that pools will do it, but the general ones you'll see now are FPPS, which is full pay per share, where they put everything together. So most of the leading mining pools right now are FPPS. PPLNS is also a common one with some of the older pools. And the difference you'll see between PPLNS payouts and FPPS payouts is a different mining fee. So historically, PPLNS, because it's a greater risk, it will be a lower mining fee than an FPPS payout. And that's just because you don't get the security of getting paid out every 24 hours.
Yeah, that consistency. And, as a miner, this is a debate we have inside our own organization consistently, is, how much risk. And interestingly, I think now that we're in this environment of very low Bitcoin price, a lot of hash added on, it's compressed margins a lot for us. And so it's a really interesting debate because, we're running very lean, and that extra margin would look really good. But then again, if we have that really bad run of luck, collectively with the pool, that could impact our ability to pay bills. And those are.
So this is an interesting thing about the margins, because we were mining profitably in 2013 when it was, $300 Bitcoin. We were mining profitably in 2014 when we bottomed out at like a $100 Bitcoin. We were still mining profitably through 2015. The OpEx really hasn't changed. I mean, it's not necessarily more expensive to run a facility today than it was back then. Power costs has actually been pretty consistent, if not actually cheaper now with new renewable technologies have come out to help supplement. What the trend I've seen actually is the hardware manufacturers are the ones that are closing down that margin. So I always find it interesting that so historically we watched Bitmain was targeting about a 90-day ROI based on profitability calculations. And then as the network started going up in value and more people started flooding into the mining space, they started realizing they could sell at like 120-day ROI, 150-day ROI, 200-day ROI, 300-day ROI. And now it's, I think, 400 or 500-day ROI.
It's well north of a year. Yeah, well north
yeah,
of a
yeah.
year.
And so I think it's just it's popularity and the hardware manufacturers realizing they can just keep charging more and more for the product. And so now what we're seeing is a lot of miners that came online in the past like year or two under these contracts with some of the major hardware manufacturers. They're overpaying for their equipment, and now their margins are getting crunched because between their expensive hardware, their expensive power contracts, or the hosting facilities that they're in, if it's costing them, $15,000 to generate a Bitcoin, and they're able to sell for $20,000, like, is it really, providing that much of a margin for them? So I've got mixed feelings about how the hardware manufacturers have been doing things, but it's
I think that what we have right now in the mining hardware world is something analogous to an oligopoly, where at the moment there are really only two material providers of equipment, MicroBT and Bitmain. There are a small number of external companies. We've worked with Bitfury, for instance, a lot. But in reality, those two have driven the market. And I think, like anything, competition will help. And Intel's entrance into the market is very interesting to me and exciting in a weird sort of way, because I used to look at them as a PC guy. They were essentially a monopoly, and I had a love-hate relationship with them in that world. I had great relationships with the people there. We did a lot of business with them, but I would often get frustrated because if I didn't like what they were doing as a PC designer, even as somebody buying millions of chips a year, I didn't have a choice. I was like, well, I gotta take this deal. I have to take this technology. I have to sign on for these terms, and that would sometimes be frustrating. It's kind of a weird thing for me, because I now see them as kind of a white knight as they come in to this industry to be the one that kind of can break it. So I'm anxious to see what happens in 2023 when a large company comes in with massive resources, with technology that it's at least in the ballpark in the first generation, and see what does it do? How does it change this infrastructure? The PC industry, which I grew up in, went through a massive sorting out period. And one of the things I've said many times is that I think when we look at the large players within our industry, by the way, whether that's at the hardware level, whether that's the mining companies, whether that's the pool operators, that massive changes can take place in, let's say, the space of 3 years. We saw that in the personal computer industry, and we've seen that in the mining pool industry. We've seen Foundry essentially go from nothing to a really large player. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but essentially overnight. And so things can happen, and they will happen, and they're unpredictable. So I guess we don't know what's going to happen, but in 2023 is going to be interesting. Intel's coming in. We'll see what happens with price. I think we're going to start feeling the halving. The halving, we'll start to feel it. Like it's not going to be in 2023, but we'll feel it.
No, people are going to start pricing it in early because they've seen the same pattern, 3 or 4 times in a row now. People are going to try to get ahead of it. So I think we're going to see an effect from the halving long before the halving comes into play. But to your point, I'm encouraged to see what Intel is doing. We thought Samsung was getting in early years ago when they were talking about the different nanometer chips that the different technology that they were working on. I'm really curious how that's going to play out. And this is almost segueing into a whole different discussion, but we're really going to start seeing the power producers and the energy companies globally, and I think we already have start paying more attention to Bitcoin mining as really a hedge against balancing power grids. So this was a discussion that I've had actually lots and lots over the last couple years. And I actually spoke on it. I think it was 2 years ago at Bitcoin Miami. Was this idea of that And so I actually talked about this a few years ago at Bitcoin Miami, and it's this idea that Bitcoin mining, or like proof of work mining in general, is really the only way we're ever going to be able to balance at scale renewable energy grids. And it's this idea that currently with power production, we're doing with, sorry, we've got
Okay.
yeah, dogs barking now. So what we typically see with at-scale energy grids for renewables is what we would typically do what's called load following. So we'd ramp up and ramp down production based on energy usage. And this is why we needed things like a fossil fuel, nuclear energy, different plants that could be easily ramped up and ramped down depending on if people had their AC units running or not. The problem with doing renewable energy is when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, you're producing electricity, and it's either on or off. You're not ramping up and ramping down to match load. So what we can actually do is we can build a facility, a energy grid that's 100% renewable, that's fully on for peak load. And the example I used was out in the Palm Springs desert. This idea that we could build a solar and wind farm that could take 100% of the load of Southern California 100% of the time. So when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing and everyone's running their AC units in the summer, all that electricity is being used up in all the residential and businesses. But then in the winter, when the energy usage is way low because people don't need their AC units all of a sudden, and power consumption is at all-time low, but the sun is still shining in Southern California, the wind is still blowing, you're still generating a crazy amount of electricity. That needs to go somewhere. And if only we knew of a network or technology that could use so much electricity and actually pay you for it, it would solve the problem. And thankfully, it's actually the only answer we've come up with so far to balance the energy grid is doing production following rather than load following with Bitcoin mining. So we've already seen some large scale miners doing this with local energy grids to turn off miners when load goes up on the grid. So we're already doing this on small scales. And I think that's a message that needs to be spread a little bit more, that we're not just burning electricity to get coins. We're not, this crazy energy waster. We're actually building a technology that will allow for renewable grids to actually work at scale.
Yeah, it's a shame that I think we're, as an industry, behind in the narrative. And some of the people who, if their apparent perspective on the world, whether that's for climate change, whether that's for certain freedom, income disparity, like there's all these different things. I think, unfortunately, a lot of those people, often categorized as progressives, really understood Bitcoin. There'd be a whole bunch of them more in the camp, but they've often put up a fence already that now we have to break down and overcome. And that's really unfortunate, somewhat predictable, frankly, because in reality, what they're professing or what they're supporting, even if their core belief is true, like save the world, reduce poverty, etc., they're aligning with a group that's true motives are opposite of that. They're centrally controlled, and they're not going to share wealth, and I don't think they give a crap about climate change. But so that's partly what we have to overcome. I've joined a group called Satoshi Action Fund.
Nice.
Trying to do that myself. Obviously, you are trying to educate as well, but it's going to be quite a battle.
And it's crazy because no one's out there saying like let the world burn. No one's out there saying let the children starve. Like no one like wants to see these bad things happen. We're all kind of on the same team of we want to see the world have renewable energy, renewable resources. We want to see civilizations grow and prosper and people to be healthy and live comfortably, right? So we're all on the same side of we think we're doing good. But I always feel like it's this idea of stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3 thinking, and I feel like a lot of people that have really good motives, they stop at stage 1 thinking. They think I see A, therefore B, but they quickly. But a lot of people don't realize that. Okay, but you see A, and that means B, but you're ignoring C, D, E, and F, which are also reasons for things happening. And that's a whole deeper philosophical discussion,
right? And they're falling for the typical things like, well, just because you consume energy, it is therefore resulting in this carbon thing, this increased carbon footprint, and then that results in this other thing. And by the way, it usually starts from the premise that what we are doing is of no value. That's the other thing, because they haven't taken the time to understand the root cause of so many of these problems is money being broken, and we're trying to fix the money.
You're gonna get me started now. So a couple thoughts. So one, when I get in discussions with people about renewable energy and like sustainability, the false premise that a lot of these discussions start on are using electricity is bad. And then my question is, well, why is using electricity bad? Well, because in their mind, generating electricity is bad for the environment. I say, okay, well, let's dive into that. Why is generating electricity bad for the environment? And when you start untangling all these like false assumptions, you realize that you're starting the discussion on a completely false premise, that using electricity is bad, or producing electricity is bad, or producing electricity is bad for the environment. When you actually start untangling a lot of that, and you get down to like a actual factual premise to start the conversation from, then a lot of their arguments are gone, because they're actually starting up here with like layers and layers and layers of assumptions, without any understanding of how an actual basic electricity grid works.
That's actually very true. There's a way to approach this on the other end of the spectrum too that I take sometimes. And I like what you've said. I mean, we can talk about, grid stability, demand response, enabling the development of renewables. If you're into that, well, this is the right way to develop them. There's all that sort of stuff I agree with. But then there's the other end of the spectrum, which I believe is at least equally important, which is, I don't know, somewhere within a few feet of me are about 6 outlets. And I view it as my fundamental right to plug into any of those outlets, whatever I want, long as I pay for it.
Mhm.
And in other words, that's a personal liberty, and that inside the walls of my home or my business, as long as I'm not doing anything that causes harm to other people or is illegal, I can do whatever the heck I want. And that could be a blow dryer, it can be a microwave oven, it can be a hot water heater, and it could be a Bitcoin miner or a Bitcoin node. And so I think people should be very careful about what they ask for, even if you're on that side, about saying Bitcoin mining should be banned, because what you're doing is you're opening Pandora's box to societal judgment, government judgment about all of your consumption of electricity. And like for me, I will give up hot water and microwaves and Christmas lights and several other electronic consumption things in my life before I would give up Bitcoin mining.
Yeah. Well,
because I
this,
believe it, because of my beliefs, right?
And so no, you're exactly right. Like once you start regulating the use of a utility in a moral, judgmental way, I mean, it just, it's Pandora's box. You're exactly right. And I wanted, so the second point and second thought I had, and it kind of touches on something you said before that, was this idea of value and utility in what we're doing. A lot of people don't understand the need for Bitcoin until they've had a very, very negative interaction with our banking system or identity systems. And once you start, like, once you've been involved in a SIM swap attack, you quickly realize that your phone number does not belong to you, and a lot of your identity revolves around your phone number. When you're involved in ACH fraud, you'll quickly realize that you have very little control over who reaches into your bank account and takes out money and how secure your actual banking is. Now, I've had the absolute pleasure of being involved in in those two scenarios actually quite a bit in my life, unfortunately. Goodness. And you know, I've had, I mean, just in the last 6 months, to give you an idea, I've had 3 of my business bank accounts hacked into for ACH fraud. Wow. And my personal account. So, you know, when you become a target and someone, you know, gets your, you know, information, then the rails and the current systems in place, you quickly realize look like a piece of Swiss cheese. And they're incredibly exploitable. And then you start looking at, well, there's got to be a better way. And then you start looking at things like stable coins and Web3 and Bitcoin cold storage and other decentralized means of banking. And it actually gives the power back to the individual for controlling not only your identity, but your banking, your personal wealth, and your data. So, you know, the technology we're working on and the security root being Bitcoin and mining being the very thing that backs the ecosystem, it's so incredibly important. And most people will not understand that until they have the IRS freeze their account, or they have someone steal their social security number from a data leak and then all of a sudden start hacking into their bank accounts or steal their cell phone number. Until people are actually personally affected by this, a lot of people just they just want to toe the line and, you know, talk on platitudes.
Yeah, I think I've already mentioned today I just went through a hurricane. Well, yeah. If you're the best time to be a salesman for hurricane insurance or flood insurance is right after one hit, and so I think it's
you're a believer.
Same there, like you get it, man. You get what happens and why those, you know, whether that's security or insurance, why those things exist when they happen to you. And that's why I've often said, I've spent a lot of time well outside the U.S., a lot of time in second, third world countries. My wife is from the Philippines, typically would be considered a third world country. And when you understand what it's like to live in those countries with those kind of financial systems, if you live in Lebanon right now, if you live in Zimbabwe or Argentina or a place like that, you get why there's so much attraction to Bitcoin specifically, because the things that you might think about, like, oh, it's very volatile relative to the dollar. Well, hell, that's on the decision tree of what's important. That's way the hell down on the list.
That was the joke, like in South America, and I think it was like Argentina, where people were actually buying used cars because holding used cars was actually more stable than holding the governmental currency.
Oh, I hadn't heard that. Makes
So
sense though.
so we see people like scrambling, and even like right now in our current economy, right, we see interest rates going up here in the US. We see the US dollar actually becoming stronger on the global currency stage, and we see people really evaluating their holdings and where their, you know, investment bankers are putting their money on a global scene, and we're realizing that governmental currencies are just as volatile and manipulated as anything else in the economies. Um, so we're looking for a better system. We're looking for a way to detach ourselves from governmental control of our identity and our currency. And that's honestly at Titan and the project we're working on, Lumerin. I'd love to touch on that too. Is what we're hyper focused on is making a better system.
Awesome. Well, I think I do want to get to all those things, a deeper dive into Titan and to whatever Lumen you said.
Lumerin, yeah.
Lumerin.
Yeah.
But let me ask you something since we're talking about custody.
Yeah.
So we had 6 weeks or so ago in the mining world, Poolin, which is one of, for those of you less familiar, one of the larger pools in the world, suddenly stopped allowing withdrawals. So, and just to set a little bit, so real high level, if you're a miner and you're mining with a pool, you generally set some thresholds, usually based on an amount, but maybe based on a time or whatever. And you say, well, every time I reach a tenth of a Bitcoin or a half a Bitcoin or whatever it is for your scale, or maybe it's once a day, I'm just going to dump out of the pool and take whatever I'm due. Now, I think that's what a lot do. I actually have a question for you about how frequently people really do that. I don't really know. I know what I do. But maybe you could tell people about the pooling situation, and I guess I'll just let you go.
So I don't have a lot of behind the scenes of like why Poolin did what they did, and we know what they publicly announced for the reasons. But it highlighted very clearly to a lot of large miners the importance of the phrase, not, what was it? Not your keys, not your coins. Yeah, and a lot of people learned that with Celsius earlier this year. A lot of people learned that with several other projects, and now the miners learned it with Poolin, because this is kind of unheard of. We haven't seen a pool do this before, and it has, I'm not aware of it, and obviously I don't know everything that's going on in the ecosystem, so it could have happened. But Poolin is a very large pool. It's very well known, and it's been around for quite a while. And for them to do something like this, I think it really shook the foundation of a lot of the miners, and kind of made them sit up a little straighter. And honestly, it made our pools look a lot better because we don't custody funds. We've been mining for a very long time. I've been doing this since 2012. It's not as long as a lot of people in the space, but it's long enough to have learned some really hard lessons. And one of them is you don't custody funds, because the moment you start custodying funds, you become the trusted party in a trustless ecosystem. And that's exactly what you don't want to be. The whole reason why we're mining, the whole reason why we believe in Bitcoin and we're backing the ecosystem, is because it is decentralized, it is trustless. And the moment you have a third party like a pool that becomes a trusted single point of failure for a miner, that's a huge risk. So this is part of the discussions I'll have with large miners when they're looking at doing a private mining pool. All I have to do is point at things like Poolin. I have to point at things like Celsius, and I say, you're a publicly traded company. How much risk are you willing to take with your income? So a lot of times people think, well, let me put it like this. I often refer to miners as the most paranoid people in the space and the most trusting people in the space. And they're the same people. Like you'll talk to a person about, you know, their crypto wallets and their security and their ledgers and all, you know, all the different things around treasury management. And they're so paranoid about certain aspects of their network security and their data and all these things around their mining operations.
Yep.
And yet they're trusting a mining pool overseas. A lot of them used to be in China, with their sole source of revenue. So in the very act of being very, very paranoid, they're also like trusting someone far beyond what they should ever trust someone with their revenue. And I think the people mining against pooling figured that out very quickly.
So maybe to expand on that a little bit, I think what you're saying is that that obviously we don't want to violate any confidences, but there may be a lot of miners of significance who are using only one mining pool for everything, or very few.
Yeah, so this is something that we've seen develop over the last few years, and this is a business model that some of the newer pools have taken into account. Was they would negotiate really, really low fees with large miners, and in exchange for those low fees, the miners would sign a contract. So a miner would say, you know, I'll mine for a 0.4% fee with you, and we'll be locked into that for the next year or two, right? The problem is, like, now they're locked into that single point of failure. They're locked into that single pool. Other miners would negotiate that with a portion of their facility. So they'll divide their facility in thirds, and they'll say this third mines against this pool, and they'll do that 3 different ways, and they'll use that as a hedge against risk. Other miners will have, because the miners can take up to 3 pools, you know, sometimes they'll have contracts with 1 pool, and then they'll have 2 backup pools. But the 2 backup pools typically aren't nearly as good on terms, or, you know, the negotiation, because they're backups. So they always will point towards that primary pool if they can. So you're right that the majority of miners are mining against 1 pool the majority of the time, and that's the source of the revenue. That's the source of their funds.
So that's clearly a concern. I would say, I mean, it's their business. They can do what they wish, but for us looking at the ecosystem, it seems to be a point of exposure or fragility or.
And so what's interesting is, so you have a very technical background. You've been on software development, hardware development, like at scale, very public companies. So you know the value of security. You know the value of you know, having multiple partners in different areas. So you're not locked into this like single source of revenue, which could be very problematic.
Yep.
So you have a lot of experience just in the technology realm. What we're seeing in mining is essentially, you know, we have a toaster, if you will, and we say you plug this toaster in and it will print money for you. And we show that toaster to someone that likes money, and they're going to think, well, how many can I have and where can I put them? And if I don't have enough money to buy a bunch of those toasters, I'm going to go out to a bunch of my friends or investors. I'm going to raise enough money to buy a bunch of those toasters, and then I'm going to figure out where to put them. The problem is, a lot of these people aren't engineers. They're not highly technical. A lot of them just are really good with finance, really good at raising money, or just company building. And they'll get deliveries of these large amounts of miners, and they'll either sit on the pallets because they're waiting for the technical side of the puzzle to show up, or they'll get things plugged in, and they think it's just plug it in and forget it. They forget that there's a huge hardware failure rate in some of these models, or running a facility at this scale. You have issues with heat and noise. So those are the major byproducts of mining. Is you're essentially creating heat and noise in ridiculous amounts. So you have a highly technical, very niche ecosystem, and you have a lot of money flooding into it, because essentially the promo was plug this toaster in and print money.
Yeah.
But now you have loads and loads of people that have been in the space for years are now becoming consultants, because we're coming in and saying, well, let me show you how to keep these miners online and optimized. Let me show you how not to lose money mining. And on the mining pool side, that's kind of what we end up doing with some larger miners of, hey, this is how to properly manage a mining pool. This is how to properly mine profitably with low risk. And more and more that it's just a matter of education at this point.
I think so. I love the toaster analogy. I hadn't heard that one before. And, I view the world through a technical lens first and foremost. And I see, without naming names, I see that a lot. We'll talk about the overall network here in a little bit too. A lot of topics I still want to try to hit with you, but
absolutely.
But I think that that presents a risk. We've, by the way, done a little of this work ourselves. Even though we're a mining company, we typically do our own work. We've done some consulting work now ourselves. But I would say these are from very astute people who understood that, but were smart enough to say, hey, before I go build a site, these are usually smaller scale sites. Before I go build a site, let me hire you to teach me how to build it. And so we're happy to do that sort of work. And we have done some of that. But I think a lot of people also, whatever they were butchers, plumbers, accountants, whatever, and got into this. And it's one thing to run 4 of them in your garage. It's a completely different thing to do it at any sort of scale. And when you start playing with even what in our world we throw around as small amounts of power, a few hundred kilowatts. Well, a few hundred kilowatts is a lot of freaking energy. You start throwing around a megawatt, 2 megawatts, 3 megawatts. That's a lot of energy. It's a lot of heat. It's a lot of, there's all kinds of things that require a lot of technical competence. And even as somebody coming from that world of designing computers, me and my team all came from that. We had a learning curve. Like we were still learning shit. So,
it's interesting because, mining historically is like hitting rocks with hammers and pickaxes, and you're digging in the earth. You're mining, and it's a very low technical thing. And you want to extract as much out of the earth for as little cost as possible, and you keep your equipment as lightweight, optimal, and you don't want it to break because you need it to last, because the margins can be slim depending on what you're mining. The analogy is so accurate with what we're doing, because every little detail of the way you design your facility could either help you out with your OpEx or become a huge hazard as you scale. Plugging in a couple devices in your garage is one thing. Having 25,000, 50,000, 100,000 devices is, like I said, you produce heat and you produce noise. Well, one of these devices that's burning 3,500 watts, one of them is fine. 10,000 of them is a forest fire. So you're producing a ridiculous amount of heat, and a lot of the way data facilities are built, and a lot of the engineering that goes into that's substantial cost. And a lot of miners try to avoid that cost because, once again, we're in this mining mentality where margins are thin. You want your equipment to last for a long time, but you also want to not break your budget on building a state-of-the-art cooling facility. So there's this mix where some people are getting ahead of it and they're saying, well, we're going to do all liquid cooling, and they pony up the upfront costs for liquid cooling, but then they run into firmware issues with the manufacturers because the manufacturers don't want you disassembling the products and submerging their chips. It's
taking
a battle,
the fans out, there's all those sorts of things. And I think it's important. I don't know if I've said this before, at least on this show. So I will. When you read a story about somebody putting up, let's say, a 200 megawatt facility or 400 megawatt facility. I want to put that number in perspective because I think it's very easy. It's a lot like the national debt at $31 trillion.
I was just thinking that. Yeah. We completely lose aspect
you
of
lose
scale.
perspective. So let me give you a little perspective. So I've done some work with El Salvador and the El Salvadorian government. I've been public with this. I would love to do some mining down there. I haven't figured out quite how to do it yet, but I'm trying. So
be on the side of a volcano.
Yeah, I'm trying. So, but I was sitting with the Secretary of Energy, the equivalent of the Secretary of Energy for the country of El Salvador.
Mhm.
And I was talking to him about the possibility of buying energy from their country. The entire country of El Salvador, 6.5 million people, runs on 900 megawatts. It's a country of put that in perspective, 6.5 million people, an entire country, all the industry, all the houses, everything in the entire country is 900 megawatts.
Yep.
So when you hear about somebody even doing 9 megawatts, okay, that's 1/100th of an entire country in a facility.
Yep.
Okay, 900 kilowatts is 1/1000th of an entire country. That's a massive amount of money. That's why, or a massive amount of energy. That's why I think sometimes it's very easy to not for these numbers to kind of get thrown around, and the danger that's associated with it. So,
Yeah,
you know,
electricity is dangerous.
yeah.
People forget about that. I had the unique experience of being able to intern at a nuclear power plant for a few summers while I was in college. I got to see firsthand going through their different programs and security programs and protection programs, how dangerous electricity can be, how dangerous nuclear radiation can be. So I had a very close look at all of that. I've been inside of a nuclear reactor. I've gotten to see a lot of interesting things. So the you're exactly right. People just don't understand the scale at which things are being done, and so something like El Salvador, where you can power the entire country off of a small production plant. Where we have Bitcoin mining facilities that are taking up all the production of some of these production plants.
Yeah.
So.
And that doesn't mean, I have my thoughts. If I think we'll kind of transition actually a little bit here, use this to kind of talk some about centralization risks and risks to the infrastructure and all that, which was actually the panel that you and I sat on together in Miami last spring. But I'll preface it this way, and maybe start with this. So I'm a designer, and you're a designer, and one of the things I'll share is that if you're trying to design something to be highly reliable for a long period of time, you have to design it with a massive amount of reliability. So as an example, if I was designing a laptop computer and I was at Gateway, we were probably about 2.5, 3 million laptops per year. And the most popular model was usually in the 800,000 to 1 million for that one model.
Yeah.
So if let's say the charging circuitry and the battery, since we're talking energy, were designed at 99% reliability and safety for a year, that means that 800 to 1,000 of those batteries are going to fail every year. It's not a very good number, right? And so if I design to 99.99, I still got that would be like 8 to 10. Well, when the result is a potential fire or an explosion, that's still not a very good number. You got to design further than that. So we would design at 6 nines, 99.9999 or better. We had a design at that level for the useful life of that product. Well, when I look at the Bitcoin infrastructure, I say, well, we're building an ecosystem that includes the miners and the pools and the custody solutions and the whole thing. Okay. And it has to operate at that level. Certainly in the early days it didn't, but now it does. It has to operate at that level or better, because we're trying to build something that will last for centuries. Like, we're not trying to build something for next year. So, is the probability, if we see a massive amount of centralization, whether that's in the mining itself, in the pools or whatever, you could probably say, well, in the next year, there's a small probability of something really bad happening. But extend that same thing to decades or centuries, and it's going to fail. Something's going to go wrong.
Yeah, and it's hard because the flight path for these crypto networks, it started out as a hobby. When I got into it, we were tinkering. It moved into an industry. People started showing up to our Bitcoin meetups wearing suits, and we're like, wait, what are you doing here? What is that, a tie? And more lawyers started getting involved, and I remember feeling out of place at a conference in 2014 where it was all of a sudden people were wearing suits, and I was like, what's going on?
Wow.
And we started moving into this like industry phase. And now we're really on the verge, if we're not already there, of it being infrastructure. And when something becomes infrastructure, as you know, after a hurricane in Florida, infrastructure is very important. And when infrastructure goes down, it's incredibly disruptive. People's lives can be ruined without infrastructure. So when we consider that we're building financial infrastructure, identity infrastructure, communication infrastructure, the reliability aspect of it is just incredibly important. And it's going to get to the point where people are relying on Bitcoin or the equivalent network for access to food. Their daily sustenance is going to come through being able to access a crypto network. I don't know if we're not quite there yet. Maybe some countries are, where people are actively paying for stuff with stablecoin. But it's going to get there. And we have to take that as a very, very serious thing. We're building an ecosystem. We're building infrastructure that has to be reliable, to your point.
Yeah, and reliable. Historically, I think people have leaned on things like 51% attack. But there are other ways that the network can be disruptive. It doesn't necessarily mean that it fails, maybe, but it can be disrupted. There's an article I wrote called Satoshi's Heel, which it basically talks about a world in which there are only a handful of big elephant-sized miners, and we only have a couple places in the world where mining exists. And I'm not predicting it, but I'm saying it's a possibility. I think maybe to get to pools, since we want to talk about Titan and pools a little more here, I pulled some stats. You can tell me if you think they're right, but I think they're pretty accurate. So
I know where this is going.
I use miningpoolstats.stream and btc.com. So I went to two sites this morning. And so what I found was, in the last 30 days, there are only 15 named pools that have found a block, even one.
Yeah.
Somewhere on the order of 2/3 of the blocks, is over 60%, were found by the top three.
Yep.
And a quarter-ish of the world's hash, maybe as much as 30%, is owned by Foundry. Now, we don't really, So maybe I'll just stop there and let you comment.
I mean, this is exactly what I brought up in Miami on the panel we were on.
Yeah.
This is like the worst kept secret in the entire Bitcoin ecosystem when we want to talk about decentralization, is that people assume that we have decentralization and 51% and scary controlling hash rate. We're long past that. You literally have 3 decision makers to decide if there's going to be a protocol update, what transactions go into a block, and if those 3 decision makers decide to whitelist or blacklist certain addresses or certain accounts, there's nothing anyone can do about it. And the reality is we wouldn't even realize that they're doing it until it's too late. So, you know, and I'm not saying that any one of these pools is doing this, but any one of these pools could be censoring transactions right now, and we just have no idea, right?
Yeah.
Now, unless you want to get into the forensics and actually look in the mempool and see like, oh, well, this this transaction has high transaction fees and it's been sitting there for a long time, and one of these three pools is not picking it up. That could be a news story in itself if it's happening. But that's the scary part. We're supposed to have a decentralized, trustless ecosystem that is uncensorable, and we've sold it. And that's why we're doing Titan. That's why we're focused on a project called Lumerin. It's this idea of decentralizing the control of hash rate. And the whole idea, so Lumerin is a decentralized routing network. It's this idea that a seller and a buyer both run a Lumerin node, and they stream data. The seller sells whatever data stream, and the buyer buys the data stream, and that engagement all happens through a smart contract. So it's trustless, it's anonymous, it's decentralized, and the routing information is all stored in an encrypted form on a smart contract. So a seller can post their hash rate for sale in a global decentralized marketplace. A buyer can purchase that hash rate through a smart contract, and then the Lumerin node from the seller transmits the hash rate to the buyer, and then the buyer can mine with it however they wish. The vision is having a mining facility with 100,000 devices that can potentially be controlled by 100,000 different people in real time, and then they can vote on where they want to send their hash rate to, rather than having a facility with 100,000 devices pointing it to one of the top 3 mining pools, and that vote is done. So the whole vision of the Lumerin network is decentralizing the control of the hash rate as a way to propagate decentralization into the future.
I think this is so important. As you mentioned, I've been talking about the miners themselves. You talked about it at the panel, and I think opened my eyes to this somewhat. It's part of why I wanted you on today. Theoretically, the top 2, even in the right circumstances, top 2 mining pools could cooperate and do a 51% attack. The likelihood of that is infinitesimal, because, by the way, I know especially the people at Foundry well, and I like the people at Foundry. I'm happy for them to have success. I mean, I love people to success, but maybe there's too much of a good thing at some point too, when too much power kind of goes to one place. And I think what you brought up, though, I think is the real crux of, at least the most likely place where I think a quote unquote attack would occur, which is a whitelist, blacklist. It's a form of censorship. And so just mechanics, just to review for everybody. So if you're trying to make a Bitcoin transaction, when it's in the pending stage, it goes into the mempool, and pools can choose whatever transactions they want. They don't have to take the most recent, or they don't have to take the most expensive.
And they don't have to take any at all.
Or they don't take any at all.
Antpool was accused of this during the Bitcoin Cash rollout, where they started mining empty blocks. So
it still happens too. I just noticed there was like 14 in the last 30 days or something like that. 14 empty blocks, something like that. And sometimes it's really small, so maybe they just choose to do an empty one. I'm not sure. I'd love to get into that a little bit with you, but I want to stay on the censorship thing for a minute.
Yeah, we can touch on that.
So anyway, I just wanted to be sure to people that, like, just because you initiate a Bitcoin transaction, it doesn't mean it has to be taken. And what could theoretically happen that Ryan's talking about, more than theoretically happen, it can easily happen, is they can just let it sit there, and by apathy, by just ignoring it, it can make your Bitcoin valueless because you can't move it.
Yeah. And so case in point, for better or worse, without getting into the geopolitical aspect of it, there's a war going on, and there is a country in the world that now has been black sheeped by every other country in the world. And high net worth individuals in that country have been banned from banking, essentially, right? Now, in this hypothetical, I don't know if this is happening, but it could very well be happening. We don't even know. Is a top mining pool could receive a list of addresses and say you're not allowed to process a transaction from that list because this war is going on and we don't support it. So it's a very it's a very real scenario that could be happening right now. And the scary thing is no one would even know, except for the individuals getting obviously affected by it.
Yeah. And they have a strange situation. Well, there's not a 1-800 number to call, or like, hey, it's not like calling Visa saying, why won't this go through? It's a very difficult thing. And then they essentially would have to reveal their identity to the world, to that address, to make a deal about it too, to say, hey, I'm trying to move 4 Bitcoin from this address and they won't let me.
And this very thing is against everything most people in the Bitcoin ecosystem believe in. The reason we got into Bitcoin initially was the freedom of banking, the freedom to own my own currency, the sovereignty in banking, and knowing that we have this this situation with mining pools. I mean, this should be, like I said, this is like one of the biggest untalked about things in the crypto ecosystem right now is the pool dilemma. It's very serious, and it has the potential to, really turn these networks into something we never wanted them to be.
Yeah, and it can theoretically get really ugly. So those individuals, like if I was one of those individuals, and especially if I had a material amount of Bitcoin and a material amount of wealth, well, I would start looking across the world to find somebody to allow that transaction to occur.
So here's interesting. Here's a fun story. Is sorry, let's switch here.
Oh,
so let's see if it reconnects. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Let's see. I think I gotta reconnect. Backup AirPods. Okay, so fun story is when Coinbase went public, Coinbase wanted to publish a message in a block, right? Very similar to the message Satoshi published in the very first block, this idea of like citing a reason why he was launching the Bitcoin network. Well, Coinbase did something similar where they were citing a bailout of Satoshi cited bailout of banks. Coinbase cited basically a stimulus signing, and this idea of like pumping more currency into the economy as though the currency was just meant nothing. But the problem is Coinbase does not control hash rate. So the Coinbase could not mint that into the Coinbase message of a block. They actually had to partner with F2 Pool to give them the message and for their IPO to mint that into a block, right? So the reality is mining and blocks are actually not, or mining blocks is not controlled by miners anymore. It's actually controlled by pools. And if an individual or a high net worth individual is locked down on a blacklist, the only way they're going to be able to move any of their Bitcoin or their currency or finances is by hiring a pool to mine a block for them or to purchase hash rate themselves. And to be able to do that anonymously and in a decentralized manner currently does not exist. And that's why we're building Lumerin. It's going to be the first global, decentralized, trustless, and anonymous hash rate marketplace.
Yeah, it's just critical. I think for like you said, for everything that we stand for in the ethos, it's important. I think pools, so we have at most 15 pools in the world that matter right now, like that can do anything, right? That means mine one block in the last 30 days. That's it, right?
Yeah.
So, I don't know the right number, but we should probably have a couple hundred. And I know that Satoshi was aware of pools or the concept of pooling, but I don't think he envisioned us being where we are today. And I think he still thought there would be this, millions of people out there just kind of mining in the background, and there maybe be some farms, but there'd also be a whole bunch of people.
This was before we had specialized hardware for mining, right? Yeah. At the time, SHA-256 was done on a CPU, and we were thinking, and he was thinking, everyone has computers, everyone has CPUs. It's cost prohibitive to have tons and tons of CPUs. Therefore, this is going to be decentralized through proof of work. We quickly adapted the algorithm to GPUs, using GPUs to run SHA-256. And then we started seeing more and more GPU farms start popping up, where you could put risers on a motherboard, and you can have like 5 GPUs on a motherboard, and you just started scaling these things. And then we started moving them into FPGAs and started realizing, we could build a circuit in an FPGA to run SHA-256 and roll that twice, and now you have a faster miner. And then we moved into ASICs. And what we've seen, and this is actually the altcoin battle, to go back to the original discussion that we had starting out, was this idea that altcoins were changing the algorithm each time because they realized that they wanted to stay ASIC resistant. And this was a big like cat and mouse game through 2013 and 2014, where a new network would come out and you'd have like X11 and X12 and Kryptonite 7 and Groskell, and all these different algorithms were coming out trying to have an ASIC resistant, and even some of them GPU resistant algorithm. And the idea was, if we can keep specialized hardware out of the algorithm, then we can keep the algorithm or the network decentralized. And I actually got into a discussion with the Siacoin guys about this, because that was their whole mentality, was keeping the algorithm decentralized with the Siacoin algorithm. And it just became this cat and mouse game where you don't want scalable hardware, you want it accessible for everyone. And that's why I wrote the paper that I wrote in 2017, was this idea of decentralized control. Is you can never guarantee the ASIC resistance of an algorithm. Maybe some algorithms are better than others. Eventually, we have to assume that all encryption is going to be cracked, and all algorithms are eventually going to be solved for with an ASIC. But what we can do is say, well, we shouldn't try to decentralize the location of the devices, right? So that's distributed computing. Okay, we want to decentralize is actually the distribution of control. That's really what decentralization is. It's the distribution of control. And there's levels of decentralization. You could say that 100 people is decentralized in some cases, but in other cases, you could say 100 people is very centralized. So our goal is to have decentralization, or the distribution of control, over as many people as possible. And that's why we think an open market around buying and selling hash rate will achieve that, if it stays anonymous, if it stays trustless, and it stays global. As long as we can have a market of selling and buying hash rate, and it's more profitable for a miner to sell their hash rate on an open market, then we can achieve this decentralization of control, or distribution of control. What I would love to see in the future is that that pools actually have to bid against each other on an open market to purchase hash rate. If a pool wants to create a block, they should actually have to bid against everyone else in order to buy that hash rate on a 24-hour basis to try to generate blocks.
That's a fascinating idea. Yeah, fascinating idea.
So, we've tried doing Stratum version 2 is still, rolling out. We've seen different, better hash style models for decentralizing the block creation. So being able to pick transactions that go in the block and moving that to the miners level. But we're all trying to work towards the same puzzle. It's the idea of decentralizing the control of block creation.
Yeah. That the latter thought, just about miners selecting transactions. I'll say I've only had some cursory conversations very, very early with some people who have said, hey, can I essentially buy some hash, maybe at some point in the future, so that I can create resistance against high fees? So, people, and these are some people that look at the future and might say, hey, I might have a consistent level of transactions I have to have occurring in 2024, 2025, 2026.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the fee structure is going to be. So is there a way that I could work with you? But I mean, in reality, it's probably me and a pool, or maybe it's even just the pool and like what you're talking about, to because, by the way, this whole mystery of fees is probably worth talking a little bit about too, which is, I'd love to get your vision, your range of possibilities about where fees go, because it has a huge implications on the revenue stream of both miners and pools going forward.
Yeah.
So I'd love to kind of post-halving. What do you see?
So it's funny because the idea of someone wanting to negotiate purchasing hash rate to circumvent fees, like in the future, it reminds me of like the CEO of Southwest that like pre-bought their fuel like so far into the future that while all the other airlines were having to raise their prices and like renegotiate, like Southwest took a huge chunk of the market because they're shored up on their fuel costs.
Right.
So it reminded me of that model. So for fees, it's interesting because people will constantly ask me, like, is Bitcoin and mining long term, is it viable? Because the blocks keep getting cut, or the block reward keeps getting cut in half, and eventually the idea of fees are going to have to take over for being adequate compensation to a miner for using all this electricity. So two things have to happen. Either the amount of fees in a block go up, or the price of Bitcoin goes up, right? So you have several different variables going into it. So if the block reward is 0, and you have, say, a half a Bitcoin to a Bitcoin of fees in a block now, that means that half a Bitcoin or Bitcoin of fees has to be worth enough to cover the electricity costs and OpEx of a miner, right? Because you have some very real static costs for a miner is the OpEx and the electricity, which are kind of mixed in there, but I like to separate them out. So we know that electricity, some of the cheapest electricity you can find currently is, I've heard down to 3.5 cents, 3 cents. I've heard miners talking about 1.5 cent and 1 cent. And I think in Venezuela, someone was telling me under 1 cent. I don't know, but a lot of people will talk. But regardless, electricity is a very real static cost. So I've always hypothesized that you could take that real static cost and the OpEx, and you could forward calculate what Bitcoin almost needs to be worth, depending on the fee structure in a block. So if there's only going to be 1 Bitcoin or 2 Bitcoins in a block of fees, and that has to be enough money to have it be worth mining, then Bitcoin needs to be $100,000, $200,000 a coin, right? So it has to make up for the value of the full block. The value of the block has to stay somewhat static, or more so than it is today, for it to make it worthwhile. So I mean, these are, once again, hardware costs could go down and all these things could change, but that's always been my hypothesis.
I think you're right. I think that I think the value of a block needs to be at a safe margin above the cost of production, right? I mean, the miners have to make a profit, and so we can expect it to commoditize, but as you've said, most likely we're going to see that the cost of that production stays relatively the same. So, there's always that age-old thing about price and hash and how did they relate to each other and what leads what. And we're in a period, by the way, I wrote an article for Bitcoin Magazine a while ago. Was it Bitcoin? I don't know. I wrote an article for somebody about how the China mining ban disrupted the correlation between the two, and that we're in a period where that is still resettling. It's my opinion that at the next halving, or at the point that we feel the next halving, which is kind of we're kind of like Jerome Powell too, right? It's not what the Fed actually does; it's what people think Jerome Powell is going to actually do. Well, it's the same sort of way. There's a point at which the realization of the halving comes in, and then okay, well then price and hash and all these other things are going to react to it. Well, I think it's the same way, and then we'll start to see kind of this natural rebalancing. But it's very important. It's extremely important. And I think this issue of censorship, I think you're onto something extremely important. The product is Lumerin.
Lumerin. It's Lumerin.
Yeah. I think a concept like that is very important. What it also does is I think it maybe makes it easier, if I'm understanding it correctly, for maybe several dozen other pools to pop up around the world, and I think if we can get them in different jurisdictions, let's say El Salvador, which is a very Bitcoin friendly and Bitcoin ethos friendly place, or maybe it's in Russia, or maybe it's in the Ukraine, or maybe it's in North Korea. I mean, I think if we're true Bitcoin people, we shouldn't really care.
And it has to be agnostic, right? Regardless of your feelings on geopolitical events, regardless of your idea of morals and ethics, it has to stay agnostic. And that's sometimes the cost of freedom. Is sometimes evil people profit just as much as good people. But for Bitcoin and cryptocurrency ecosystems to survive, it has to stay agnostic.
Yeah. And I would add, by the way, I don't think it's Bitcoin's job to determine good and evil, because those are just, I mean, all of us have our own perspective of it, but it's just our perspective. And
that's, I mean, there's so many things in our life that are controlled for us, right? We were, and I said this in Miami too, and kind of my closing remarks, is this idea that for better or worse, we were born into ecosystems that were essentially chosen for us. The way we handle identity, the way we handle banking, the way we communicate, a lot of that is just following the tide of society. The problem is when you start looking into an aspect called freedom. Freedom is a very scary thing for governments, because governments a lot of times survive off of control, whether it be control of financial systems, control of communication systems, control of even property, and down to a granular level. Governments survive off control, long term anyways. So something like cryptocurrency, something like these decentralized networks can be incredibly threatening to a lot of governments. And that's like this fine line that we're trying to walk here, is how do we build systems that provide freedom and sovereignty for the individual, but aren't immediately like squashed and like attacked by governmental authorities worldwide. You know, and we've seen it, like China is essentially attacking a lot of these systems by, you know, banning them. We've seen it in a lot of countries doing that. So it's I don't have the answer for it. I just know that we're building technology and we're working in an ecosystem that is providing freedom, that is protecting freedom, and it's giving the individual sovereignty. And that is something I strongly believe in. And working with the governmental authorities and working inside the bounds of compliance, you know, it's a balancing act that we're very cognizant of, especially here in the U.S. when it comes to finances. It's not an easy thing to navigate.
It's very hard, and it's my personal opinion. That's part of the reason I'm here, is that I don't believe money should be a weapon. I don't believe it should be a means of control.
Yep.
And I even think that while each of us probably has our own perspective about like good and evil, certain countries, or at least the leadership in those countries, being good or evil, that by allowing, by them, if they use Bitcoin as a way to circumnavigate sanctions, I believe it's a Pandora's box for them. That that if they start transacting with Bitcoin, that essentially what they've done is they will in the short term benefit, but in the long term they'll find that it's now eating from the inside out to provide freedom within that country, that they've let the seeds of freedom into their very own country by doing that. And so I say let them, right? And support them, and I hope they do.
It's an interesting thing. So in a different direction, and kind of on the same idea of freedom, so we talk about like banking and financial freedom. Another aspect is freedom of communication, and a lot of like who we are and our identity is wrapped up into these communication devices, if you will. It'd be our phones, it'd be our Instagram account, our Facebook account, all our social media, the way we interact with people, even through our telephone number. That's really become our identity. That's how people contact us. That's how people access us. And I feel like that's another single point of failure, because that's a place in this society and in this world that actually we don't control those accounts. We don't control our Facebook account. We don't control our, you know, Telegram or anything. We're using a platform that is very susceptible to censorship, as we've seen, as our primary means of communication and our primary means of identity. And this is another area that, you know, we're actually going to be working on with the Lumerin project. So first off with the Lumerin project is hash rate, this idea of decentralization of control and routing hash rate. But because we have this idea of, we have a sender node and a receiver node that are transacting through a smart contract, we can actually take that same model and we can build a decentralized communication mechanism where rather than having a cell phone number, if you will, I can have a private key or a wallet, and you can open up a direct socket to my node if I give you an NFT, for example. And that NFT allows your node to create a direct socket to my node, and then we can communicate through an encrypted channel. So that's like that's base level, is how do I transact communication or data in a decentralized way, and now own my identity, own my ways of communicating it through a decentralized network. So that's that's a whole nother rabbit hole discussion. But I wanted to touch on that because I think that's really important too when it comes to freedom, is this idea of building projects that allow us to own our currency, own our identity, and own our communication.
So where this might be a good place to kind of wrap up a little bit, Ryan. Where do people learn about Lumerin? Where do they learn about Titan?
Yeah.
Where else would you like to direct them?
Yeah, so Titan.io is everything mining pools. If you're interested in getting involved in the mining pool, you can go to pool.titan.io, check it out. So definitely love for you to evaluate the software. We believe in fully transparent mining, even to the point where our full pool wallet and our reserves that back our payouts is actually fully auditable and accessible. And that's all actually in the interface. So that's almost unheard of in the full ecosystem right now.
Yeah, I can
you
validate.
Actually,
I saw that this morning.
You can see our wallets. So Titan.io is our pool side, and then our open source development efforts is the Lumerin project. So it's LUMERIN, and that's .io. So you can follow us on Telegram, follow us on Twitter. It's not an easy nut to crack. It's a very difficult project. We've been working at it for a couple years now. And we've made some amazing headway in it. But yeah, we post all our updates on lumerin.io.
Outstanding. I'm really glad we got a chance to do this today, Ryan. I think what your mission is very philosophically aligned with my mission, with me personally, and with my companies, hopefully with a lot of listeners. And I'll just say to everybody out there, a lot of you are in the mining community. Throw a little hash at Titan and throw a little hash at somebody else other than the big 3 to 5. These people need our support. The ecosystem needs our support. It's not all just about the money, although I don't know that you'll find any financial damage from going with any of these. You might even find a little more, and that's wonderful. But reduce your dependency on the bigger players, support the ecosystem, and support people like Ryan who are key to the future of Bitcoin itself. So Ryan, thank you very much for coming on today, and really look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, Bob. Likewise.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Ryan Condron. Mining pools play such an important role in the Bitcoin ecosystem, and it's vital that a diverse set of mining pools be available to all miners, and also that the hash rate is reasonably distributed across them. Ryan and the Titans team's efforts really need our support. Ryan can be found on Twitter at Ryan K. Condron, and you can learn more about Titan at titan.io. Mind Your Business is brought to you by Barefoot Mining. And if you'd like to support this show, donations to the Bitcoin wallet address listed in the show notes would be greatly appreciated. The music in the intro and outro is a song called Flight from my friend and fellow Bitcoiner Jordan Critz. Please check him out on Spotify, iTunes, or your favorite music platform. Nothing in this show should be construed as legal, tax, or financial advice.